Secretary of the United States, Pete Buttigieg, who joins us right now. Secretary, very good to have you. Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Let me ask you first about where we stand right now. It seems a little better today, but then again, the weekend's over. What did you make of how the airline industry functioned this past weekend?
That's right. So this last holiday travel weekend had some of the busiest days of the entire year. I was very concerned with what happened over the Memorial Day weekend, got the airlines together, asked them what steps they were taking and anything that that we could do collaboratively to see improvements by the July 4th holiday travel weekend. The good news is this last travel weekend went better than Memorial Day did in terms of delays and cancellations. We saw an improvement to the tune of about 10%, but it's still elevated from a normal year.
Though, right?
Yeah, so we saw about 3% of flights canceled. In a normal year over that travel weekend, you'd want to see the number really below 2. So it's still higher than it should be. Number of issues contributing to that, and we're going to continue using our Consumer Protection Enforcement Authority to make sure that when that does happen to passengers, that they are properly compensated, as well as looking at the operational side to watch that number of delays and cancellations continue to go down, because it's not yet at a level that I consider acceptable.
Well, that's probably an understatement to your point. Let me ask you, though, Secretary, Bernie Sanders has said it's time for the Transportation Department to impose fines on poor-performing airlines. He was suggesting that, you know, if passengers are hurt to delays of more than 1 hour, that they be compensated for that up to $55,000 if it goes on indefinitely. How do you feel about that?
Well, look, we certainly shouldn't be afraid to take aggressive measures when that's appropriate. As a matter of fact, earlier on my watch, we issued the heftiest fines that have ever been assessed against airlines that failed to do what they need to do when it comes to refunding passengers who've been canceled. In terms of this specific proposal, there's more analysis to be done on the effect that those levels of fines would have on the aviation sector and the national aviation system. But, you know, I'm open to those ideas that are coming in from Capitol Hill. We're going to continue working on our side with the authorities that we have right now. We've updated our interpretation of what are called unfair and deceptive practices when we see those. I have the authority in certain ways provided by Congress to act on that. We're undertaking an investigation right now on the issue of customer service, because, you know, when you do have, and look, sometimes with weather or other issues, there's a cancellation or a delay that can't be avoided. But when that does happen, you got to be able to get somebody on the phone. And we've been taking complaints and hearing about cases where you've got hours and hours and hours just to have somebody take care of you. That's another responsibility that the airlines have. So we're going to continue pressing the airlines with the authorities that we have, and always open to ideas. They have to be ideas that actually work and give us a better system than we already have.
Unfortunately, to your point, though, Secretary, these guys, the airline industry, through COVID, received better than $50 billion in taxpayer support. Understandable at the time when their whole business ground to a halt because of COVID. But what did they do with that money, and how were they not prepared for the demand that would inevitably come as the economy got back and people got back to flying?
That's right. Look, tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer support went to these airlines for the purpose of keeping people in their jobs. And part of the idea was, if we keep people employed, that means that, you know, we'll have that airline sector up and running for when the demand comes back. Now the demand has come back faster than most people thought possible, part of a general return of demand and spending in our economy that happened much more quickly than expected. Of course, that's a good thing, but the airlines have to be prepared to service the tickets that they sell.
Well, where did that money go, sir? Where did that money go? Now, a lot of that money came before you took office. I understand.
Here's where the money went. So here's where the money went. Here's where the money went. It went to keep people on the job and prevent people from being laid off and furloughed. So the way the bill was set up, it said you can't fire anybody. Now, here's what happened, though. While they complied with the bill in that technical sense, you still saw the airlines guide a lot of their pilots and experienced crews into early retirement. And so, that didn't violate the terms of all this taxpayer money that came to them. It said you can't fire people. Early retirement's a little different. But what these buyouts and retirements did was they left these airlines unprepared to service those routes. And now that's coming back to bite the entire system. So that is a real concern. And I think passengers are understandably asking, wait a minute, with all this taxpayer funding going over, why are we seeing the system not able to keep up with demand now that passengers are ready to fly again?
But they can't get a lot of these pilots back for love or money, right, Secretary? Now, there were about, 1,700 of the pilots for Delta, for example, who were protesting. And I wondered when they were protesting if a lot of Delta flyers were seeing them, so why aren't you flying the plane? What did you make of all of that?
Yeah, look, when you talk to pilots, flight attendants, they're working a lot of overtime, but they can only take on so many shifts. First of all, because of safety requirements, and secondly, because you can just only work so many hours when it's dramatically more than what you signed up for. So that's why we also need to have a stronger pipeline. That means competitive pay. We have seen some regional airlines increasing their pay. I think that's a good move. People would be kind of shocked to find out how little a pilot gets paid when they enter into that regional airline workforce. That's a good step. On our side, we're actually funding curriculum development in high schools, colleges, dozens around the country to build up that sense of interest in aviation so that we can more readily recruit and train pilots. Right. But a lot of it, like any job, comes down to compensation and job quality.
But then how do you address that? How do you address that, Secretary? I know you oversee the FAA as well. There are worker shortages there. But when it comes to pilots, and I think the retirement age remains 65. Should it? Would you be for increasing that to increase the pool of available workers then who could fly these planes that oftentimes they're begging to find pilots?
Look, I'm much more interested in raising the bar on things like compensation and job quality than lowering the bar on something like safety. And when you get to these training hours, the retirement age and those things, those are fundamentally safety regulations. The United States of America should be able to have a robust aviation system without watering down our expectations on safety.
You think you compromise safety with an old, I'm sorry, Secretary, are you compromising safety with a pilot older than 65? Because a lot of people say 65 is the new 55, and we have a president who's almost 80. So what's the big deal if we went up a few more years?
Look, that regulation is there for safety reasons. I haven't seen any piece of information or data that would suggest that the reasoning has changed. And so I'm going to look at other steps that are not affecting safety. If somebody wants to present their ideas, we'll always take a look at it. But safety is the bedrock of why my department even exists. It's the founding mission of the FAA. And we are always, by the way, think about how remarkable it is that we have such an extraordinary safety record in a country where 40,000 people a year are killed in car crashes. Millions of passengers are shot through the air nearly at the speed of sound and return to or get to where they're going safely. That isn't something that just happened. It took a lot of work to get it to be that way. It's going to take a lot of work to keep it that way. And that's our commitment.
All right. No doubt that the safety is important. You're right. But to a lot of Americans flying this summer, they've given up any hope that it will be a smooth ride. You experienced it yourself not too long back when your own plane was delayed. And I'm beginning to wonder whether people have just lost confidence in the airline industry between a lot of them abandoning routes, cutting back the number of cities that they service, and even taking a lot of planes out of service, whether that was ever envisioned in the $50+ billion taxpayers gave them. Do you think that they wasted that money?
Look, when that money went out, when the rescue plan passed, one of the first things I heard was that flight attendants and other airline workers were told that they could tear up their furlough notices. I don't think that was a waste of money. I think that was a very good thing. Many of these airlines, if not all of them, might have completely collapsed and gone out of business. I mean, we sometimes forget, I think, in the chatter, just how close this economy came to going off the brink. And that was definitely true for the airline. So, look, I don't think it was a mistake to keep the U.S. aviation sector in business. I do think the airlines that accepted all of this funding need to be able to service the routes that they're selling tickets for.
So when you look at the industry the way it is now, and I think you would advocate, Secretary, like a stress test, like we give banks, whether we had something akin to, the financial meltdown, they could handle that. Now, most of the banks have come through okay with these tests, but do we need something similar for the airline industry? Because something tells me that they would fail that test, and they have, at least in recent weekends. So what do you advocate?
Yeah, I think among other things, they've got to demonstrate that they can service their routes. So one of the things I talked to them about after Memorial Day was stress testing their schedules to make sure that they could actually support those schedules with more realistic assumptions about staff, as well as things that are a little less in their control, like weather, and things that we're working with them on, like the air traffic control side of the house. All of those things need to be going right in order for flights to operate and move smoothly. But we clearly have hit issues that demonstrate that this sector is not as resilient as it needs to be. It's a very concentrated sector. If you go back to when deregulation first took place, nobody really argued or believed that there would be as few airlines as there are today in this market. And that means that, if that's going to be the industry structure, we have to stay very closely on top of them to make sure that consumers, taxpayers, passengers are protected. And that's exactly what we do with the consumer protection function in my department. In addition to the FAA looking after operational safety with things like air traffic control, we have an Office of Consumer Protection. I'll tell you, we've had a real uptick in the number of complaints in there. We're going through that, looking again at everything from prompt refunds to just being able to get somebody on the phone.
Secretary, finally, on gas prices, continue to rise, although of late they've been stabilizing. I know the administration has focused on the energy companies and whether they're gouging Americans. There's no evidence of that. But he did add now gas station owners, that they should do more. Seeing as better than 95% of them are individually run and have nothing to do with the oil companies, do you think that was fair? Do you think that the owners of gas stations in this country are deliberately gouging Americans?
Well, look, the one group of people that we see who are actually happy about what's happening with gas prices are oil company executives and owners. We've seen them out there saying, they're not going to increase production. And why would they when they're this profitable? It's why the president has proposed a use it or lose it policy. You're sitting on these permits or leases and you're not producing in a way that's going to lower prices.
Secretary, are you blaming the oil companies for this? Are you blaming the oil companies for this?
It's frustrating to see it. Well, I'm certainly holding oil companies responsible for their choice not to produce. And again, even though congressional Republicans, I think, are not going to allow this to happen, we believe a use it or lose it policy that says if you're sitting on these permits or leases, you ought to do something with them is responsible. Look, obviously, there are and always have been a lot of different factors that global petroleum markets, one of which, obviously, is the fact that a major oil-producing country launched a war of aggression and destabilized so much of the world economy when they did.
But half of the price. Wait a minute. Half of that increase started prior to the first Russian soldiers arriving near Ukraine. You can't blame it all on Ukraine, right?
What about the other half?
Well,
what about the other half? No, that's a pretty important half.
Well, but that half before we had run up. Your administration has blamed this on the war, and that was certainly a big factor. But gas prices had gone up 50% already before the war. So to me, that's half of the blame, not all the blame.
Yeah, and what I'm saying about is that when it comes to these sky-high gas prices, drivers are mad about it. I'm mad about it. The president's mad about it. Oil company executives are thrilled because this is good news for them. And I think when the incentives are that divided between them and the American people, it's very important for Congress to do everything it can to ensure that consumers are protected. That's all we're saying with this use it or lose it idea. I don't know that it would take care of every issue with global petroleum markets, but I'm pretty sure that it would help.
All right, they know supply and demand, as you do, Secretary, and I'm an apologist to the oil companies here, but if they could get their hands on more land to take advantage of this and know if they tapped it all, with the demand being what it is, they could still make, busloads of money. Wouldn't that be in their interest? By fingering them, and they're no saints, they want to make money, they'd have a great opportunity to make more money in this environment. Why wouldn't they?
Why are they sitting on these opportunities to produce right now? It's because this environment where they're extremely profitable and the rest of us are getting killed is actually pretty favorable for their bottom line. And the question
Would it be
is,
even more favorable
in
with
a
more
market
lands,
like,
right? If they're limited with those 9,000 type, permits and licenses you talk about, then they're not all going to be gushers, so they can't act to them all. And even that 9,000 is about half what it was 18 months ago. I'm just saying, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they pounce on it? Why wouldn't they pounce on it now, right?
Because they make more money with the status quo. Right? That's the bottom line. And when incentives are that misaligned between oil company executives and the rest of us, that's when you got to take a look at a policy intervention. That's what policy exists for, is to try to make sure that companies that are out there to make a buck, which is what companies do, fine. But when they do, doesn't happen in a way that hurts the American people. I don't think anybody thinks that oil markets are a textbook example of a natural, supply and demand driven, perfectly competitive part of the economy. We know that they are massively shaped by everything from war and peace around the world to policy decisions. We just think more of those policy decisions ought to be ones that favor the consumer instead of the oil company executives and owners.
But are you saying, sir, just to be clear, that they are rigging the game? There have been government investigations into this very issue under Republican and Democratic administrations, I believe a dozen times over 40 years. Not a one has been able to accurately prove or state that this is what was going on, that this cabal was acting to hoard prices and to screw consumers. It hasn't happened.
So look, if them keeping prices up while declining to produce more isn't breaking any laws, then I guess I'd like to ask whether we could have better laws. That's what I'm saying.
But are you saying they're the reason why the prices are up? Nothing else is going on?
Well, again, we know that there are always lots and lots of things that drive oil markets and gas prices.
But your administration has targeted them, right? Your administration has targeted them, and that's the reason, and nothing else.
Well, again, I feel like we've presented multiple reasons. We just talked about a couple of them. One of them clearly is Putin's war of aggression. When you have a country go to war that's an oil-producing country, that affects oil markets. We think the behavior of oil companies is another reason. We know that the fact that demand has come roaring back in this economy much faster than predicted, with millions of jobs created and a lot more money going into Americans' pockets than expected, has created a demand pressure that in any market affected by supply and demand is going to have an effect. Right. Those are just some of the things. And then when there's things that are under the administration's control, the petroleum reserve, the ethanol flexibility, the opportunity for relief on the gas tax, the president and the administration are going to pull those levers. But I think it would be a real mistake to give Vladimir Putin a pass, and I think it would be a real mistake to give oil executives a pass at a moment like this, when they might be the only people in the country who are perfectly happy with the gas price environment we're living with today.
But it is not just the Putin gas tax hike, right?
It's not just anybody. It's not just any one factor. That's my whole point. That's why I'm mentioning all of those things.
I don't want to belabor the point. You've been very patient, but you've been very patient. But all I hear is the Putin hike, the Putin hike, the Putin hike. And then I started looking around. I wondered, geez, what else happened?
Yeah, well, like we said, a lot of things going on, right? Okay. But let me mention one other thing.
Sure.
Since there are all of those dynamics that we just talked through that affect oil prices, some of which I think could be shaped by Congress, could be, if they backed consumers, could be shaped by the choices of oil executives. There are a lot of other things that are frankly more responsive to policy choices than others, like the cost of prescription drugs. And we believe that we ought to take action to lower the cost of prescription drugs, lower the cost of insulin, lower the cost of health care, child care, housing, elder care. These are things that Congress could do right now that the president has called for. There's been a lot of opposition to it among congressional Republicans, but precisely because there are, as you correctly note, lots of different factors that drive oil prices, we could also be doing a lot of work at the same time on some of the issues that are more directly sensitive to the policy choices that are made in Washington that would give Americans relief every day at the kitchen table.
Understood. Sir, thank you. And staying a little long with us, we do appreciate that. The Transportation Secretary of the United States, Pete Buttigieg. Secretary, thank you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.